There is a version of doubt that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with panic or visible collapse. Instead, it settles quietly, almost respectfully in the background of conviction. It appears not when belief is weak, but when belief has endured long enough to be tested by reality. This is the kind of doubt that emerges not from ignorance, but from experience, when expectations meet outcomes that do not fully align. It does not destroy belief outright. Rather, it bends it, questions it, examines it from angles that were previously ignored. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this kind of doubt is that it can exist even in those who once seemed unshakable. It does not discriminate between the confident and the uncertain. It reaches both. In the narrative we are reconstructing, this doubt is carried by a man who had once stood as a voice of clarity in a world of confusion. He was not someone easily swayed. His identity had been built on certainty, on purpose, on a role that seemed clearly defined. Yet even he, isolated and removed from the movement he once witnessed directly, found himself asking a question that echoed far beyond his immediate circumstances. It was not simply a question about identity. It was a question about direction, about whether the unfolding of events matched what had been promised, what had been expected, what had been believed so firmly before. And this is where the narrative becomes deeply human, because it acknowledges something most people try to avoid, that even the strongest convictions are not immune to questioning when circumstances shift. The response to this doubt is what reframes everything. It does not come in the form of argument or persuasion. There is no attempt to overpower the doubt with force or intellectual dominance. Instead, the response points outward toward observable reality. It directs attention to what is happening, not what is being claimed. Sight being restored, movement returning to the immobile, isolation being broken, life appearing where there had been none. These are not abstract ideas, they are tangible shifts in reality. And yet the response does not explicitly declare identity through these acts. It allows the evidence to speak, leaving interpretation to the one who observes. This approach is subtle but significant. It does not demand belief, it invites recognition. What follows is perhaps even more important. A statement that reveals the true barrier is not lack of evidence, but the interpretation of it. The warning is not against disbelief itself, but against stumbling over what is already visible. This introduces a deeper layer of complexity, because it suggests that the issue is not always what is shown, but how it is received. Two people can witness the same reality and arrive at completely different conclusions, not because the reality is unclear, but because perception is influenced by expectation, by bias, by what one is prepared to accept or reject. And this is where the narrative begins to shift from external events to internal processes. Attention is then redirected toward another figure, one who had already played a significant role in preparing the way. The question posed to the crowd is not about what they saw, but why they went to see it. It challenges their motives, their expectations, their assumptions about what significance looks like. Because people tend to associate importance with appearance, status, presentation, comfort. But the figure they had witnessed did not fit those categories. He existed outside of them, deliberately so. And this contrast exposes something important, that truth often does not align with the structures people are accustomed to recognizing. This leads to a paradox that becomes central to the entire narrative. Greatness is redefined, not in terms of visibility, power, or recognition, but in terms of alignment with something deeper. And within this redefinition, there is an inversion. Those who appear least significant within the emerging structure are described as greater than those who stood at the peak of what came before. This is not an easy idea to accept, because it challenges hierarchical thinking. It suggests that value is not determined by position within a system, but by relationship to the underlying truth of that system. And that redefinition destabilizes traditional measures of importance. The narrative then expands to critique the broader response of the generation witnessing these events. Their reactions are inconsistent, almost contradictory. They reject extremes on both ends, those who withdraw completely and those who engage openly. This inconsistency reveals that the issue is not the behavior being observed, but the unwillingness to accept anything that does not conform to personal expectations. It exposes a deeper resistance, not to specific actions but to transformation itself, because transformation requires adjustment and adjustment requires discomfort. From here, the tone sharpens. The focus shifts toward accountability, not in a generalized sense but directed toward specific communities that had been exposed to undeniable evidence and chose not to respond. The comparison drawn is uncomfortable. It suggests that those with less exposure to truth are, in some sense, less accountable than those who have seen more and done nothing. This introduces a principle that runs throughout the narrative, that clarity increases responsibility. The more one understands, the less room there is for inaction without consequence. And yet, just as the weight of this realization begins to settle, the narrative pivots again, this time toward something quieter, almost intimate. Gratitude is expressed, but not for what people typically celebrate. Instead, it is directed toward the accessibility of truth, not to those who rely on complexity or status, but to those who approach it with openness. This reinforces the earlier inversion. Access is not determined by qualification but by receptivity. Finally, the narrative narrows into something deeply personal. An invitation is extended, not to the strong, not to the certain, but to the weary, to those carrying burdens they cannot manage alone. And the promise is not removal of responsibility, but transformation of how it is carried, a shift from weight that crushes to something that can be sustained. This is where the tone softens, not by reducing the seriousness of the message, but by offering a different way of engaging with it. And that is where this beginning settles, not in resolution, but in reorientation. Because before anything else can happen, perspective must change. And once perspective changes, everything that follows begins to take on a different shape. There is a form of understanding that does not arrive through action, but through stillness. It is not forced, not constructed through effort, but revealed in moments where movement slows and attention sharpens. These moments are often overlooked because they do not feel productive. They do not resemble progress in the conventional sense. There are no visible results, no measurable gains, no immediate confirmation that anything meaningful is happening. And yet, it is within this quiet stillness that some of the most foundational shifts occur. Because when external noise fades, internal patterns become visible. What once felt stable begins to reveal its fragility. What once seemed clear begins to show its inconsistencies. And in that exposure, something deeper begins to take shape. The narrative transitions into this space deliberately. It moves away from public interaction, from crowds and confrontation, into something far more controlled and introspective. A setting where guidance is not demonstrated through spectacle, but through consistency. The imagery is simple, almost understated: movement through open land, provision without excess, direction without confusion. There is no urgency here, no pressure to perform. Instead, there is a steady rhythm, a quiet assurance that what is needed will be given, not in abundance that overwhelms, but in sufficiency that sustains. This distinction is critical, because people often associate provision with excess, with visible abundance that signals security. But true stability is not built on excess. It is built on reliability. And yet, even within this calm, the narrative does not allow for complacency. It introduces a shift, subtle at first, but significant. The environment changes. The open field gives way to something darker, less certain. Visibility decreases. The path becomes harder to interpret, and with that shift, instinct reacts. Fear begins to emerge, not because danger is confirmed, but because uncertainty increases. This is where the narrative reveals something essential. Fear is not always a response to actual threat. It is often a response to lack of clarity. When vision is compromised, imagination fills the gap, often with worst-case scenarios. But the response to this fear is not what one might expect. There is no attempt to remove the valley, no effort to restore immediate visibility. Instead, the focus is redirected toward presence. The absence of fear is not achieved by eliminating difficulty, but by recognizing that difficulty does not exist in isolation. There is something constant that does not shift with environment, does not weaken with uncertainty. And it is this constancy that stabilizes perception. The valley remains, the darkness remains, but their impact changes. They no longer define the experience. They become part of it, not the center of it. This distinction alters everything. Because if stability is not dependent on environment, then it cannot be taken away by changing circumstances. It becomes internal, not external. And once stability is internalized, external fluctuations lose their power to destabilize. This is not an easy transition to make. It requires letting go of a deeply ingrained assumption that safety is tied to control over surroundings. But the narrative challenges that assumption directly. It suggests that control over surroundings is limited, but alignment with something constant is not. From here, the imagery intensifies again. The setting does not return to isolation or safety. Instead, it moves into confrontation, not in the sense of conflict, but exposure. A table is prepared not away from opposition, but in its presence. This is a deliberate contrast. It demonstrates that provision does not require the absence of challenge. In fact, it can exist alongside it. And this challenges another assumption, that peace and conflict cannot coexist. The narrative suggests otherwise. It presents peace not as the absence of opposition, but as independence from it. This leads into a broader shift in perspective, one that moves beyond immediate experience into something more future-oriented. There is mention of preparation, but not in a way that aligns with human instinct. Preparation here is not reactive. It is not based on anticipating specific events or outcomes. It is proactive, rooted in an understanding that what lies ahead has already been accounted for. This introduces a level of trust that is difficult to maintain because it requires accepting that not everything needs to be understood in advance. And this is where resistance naturally forms, because people are conditioned to seek clarity before commitment. They want to understand the full path before taking the first step. They want certainty before action, but the narrative reverses this order. It suggests that clarity often follows movement, not the other way around. That understanding is not always a prerequisite for action, but a result of it. And this inversion is uncomfortable because it removes the safety of complete knowledge. Questions arise naturally in response. They are not dismissed, but they are not answered in the expected way either. Instead of providing detailed explanations, the narrative reframes the questions themselves. It shifts focus from external direction to internal alignment. It suggests that the path is not separate from the one walking it. That direction is not something to be followed blindly, but something to be embodied. This is a difficult concept to grasp because it requires redefining how guidance is understood. It is no longer about receiving instructions. It is about maintaining connection. And connection introduces another layer of complexity because connection is not static. It requires maintenance. It requires attention. It can weaken if neglected. And this is where the narrative introduces the concept of dependence, not in a negative sense but in a structural one. Growth is not independent. It relies on connection to a source that sustains it. Remove that connection and decline begins. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. This is where the illusion of control begins to dissolve, because independence, as it is often understood, is revealed to be incomplete. True stability is not achieved through isolation, but through sustained connection. And this challenges a deeply held belief that strength comes from self-sufficiency. The narrative suggests the opposite. That strength comes from alignment with something beyond oneself. As this realization settles, the narrative does not rush to resolve it. It allows the tension to remain. Because understanding does not immediately translate into acceptance. There is a gap between recognizing truth and living it, and that gap is where most of the struggle occurs. It is where decisions are made, where direction is chosen, where the abstract becomes practical. And so, this part concludes not with certainty, but with awareness. An awareness that control is limited, that clarity is partial, that connection is essential. and that moving forward will require trusting what cannot yet be fully seen. There is a moment in every unfolding process where what was once concealed begins to surface, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a steady inevitability that cannot be reversed. It is not forced into visibility. It simply reaches a point where it can no longer remain hidden. This exposure does not discriminate between what is favorable and what is not. It reveals everything equally: intentions, patterns, inconsistencies, and truths that were previously easier to ignore. And what makes this moment particularly unsettling is that it does not rely on external discovery. It emerges from within, shaped by accumulation rather than interruption. The narrative now turns toward this inevitability with a clarity that removes any illusion of permanence in secrecy. It introduces a principle that is both simple and disruptive. Nothing remains concealed indefinitely. Every hidden word, every private action, every silent decision eventually finds its way into the open, not always in the form people expect, but in ways that cannot be denied. This is not presented as a threat, but as a structural reality, because what is internal inevitably influences what becomes external. There is no absolute separation between the two. What is cultivated within shapes what is expressed without, and over time, that expression becomes visible. This realization shifts the foundation of how behavior is understood. If nothing remains hidden, then actions cannot be justified based on invisibility. They must be aligned with consistency, regardless of who observes them. This removes a layer of conditional behavior that many rely on, the idea that actions can be adjusted depending on visibility. Instead, it introduces a standard that does not change based on observation. And this standard is not enforced externally, it is sustained internally. It is a shift from performance to alignment. From here, the narrative addresses fear again, but now with greater precision. It distinguishes between immediate fear and enduring consequence. Most fear is directed toward what can be seen: physical harm, social rejection, loss of position. These fears are immediate, tangible, and therefore easier to recognize. But the narrative redirects attention toward something less visible but more significant, what persists beyond the immediate moment. It suggests that focusing solely on temporary threats creates a distorted hierarchy of fear. It prioritizes what is short-lived over what is lasting. At the same time, it introduces a counterbalance to this shift, a reminder of value that is both specific and expansive. The smallest details, things often dismissed as insignificant, are accounted for with precision. Nothing is overlooked. Nothing is forgotten. And if that level of attention exists for what is small, then the implication extends outward. It suggests that value is not determined by scale or visibility, but by inherent significance. This redefines how importance is measured. It removes the assumption that only what is large or visible matters. This dual awareness of consequence and value creates a new framework for understanding fear. It is no longer driven by immediate discomfort, but by alignment with something that extends beyond the present moment. And within this framework, fear loses its dominance. It does not disappear, but it is repositioned. It becomes secondary to understanding. And this repositioning allows for a different kind of stability, one that is not dependent on avoiding discomfort, but on maintaining alignment despite it. The narrative then shifts abruptly, but intentionally, toward something more practical. A voice emerges from within the crowd, not addressing anything profound, but something ordinary. A dispute over division, over ownership, over what belongs to whom. It is a familiar concern, one that reflects the everyday realities people navigate. And yet, the response does not engage with the specifics of the dispute. It bypasses the surface issue entirely and addresses something deeper, the underlying assumption driving it. The assumption is that life is defined by accumulation. That security comes from what is owned, what is stored, what is controlled. And this assumption is deeply embedded. It shapes decisions, priorities, and perceptions of success. But the narrative challenges it directly, not through abstraction, but through illustration. It presents a scenario that appears rational on the surface. A person with more than enough, seeking to secure the future by expanding capacity, by increasing storage, by ensuring long-term stability through material means. At first glance, this approach seems logical. It aligns with conventional thinking. It reflects a desire for security, for preparation, for control over what lies ahead. But the narrative introduces a disruption, not gradual, but immediate. The timeline assumed does not hold. The future that was being prepared for is suddenly removed from reach. And with it, the entire structure built on that assumption collapses, not because the preparation was wrong in itself, but because it was incomplete. It accounted for resources, but not for time. This is where the illusion of control becomes clear. Control over resources does not equate to control over outcomes. And when the latter is assumed, the former becomes fragile, because it is built on a foundation that cannot be guaranteed. This realization does not condemn preparation, but it redefines its purpose. Preparation is not about securing certainty. It is about aligning with what remains constant, even when circumstances shift. From here, the narrative returns to something more pervasive: worry. Not as a fleeting emotion, but as a pattern of thought, a habit of projecting into the future, attempting to resolve what has not yet occurred. Worry creates the illusion of control, the sense that thinking through every possibility will produce stability. But the narrative exposes its limitation. It does not alter outcomes. It only consumes attention, and attention is a finite resource. When it is directed toward